Hello, and welcome to another video lecture for Mr. Mosier's 8th grade U.S. History class. The topic for today's video lecture is on the Homestead Strike. This is some background information and context for a primary source analysis activity that we'll be completing in class. The textbook readings that goes with the Homestead Strike can be found on page 624 to 627 in the Industrial Workers section of our textbook. The guiding question is what actually happened at the Homestead Strike in 1892? Who's responsible? Who should be blamed for this violent incident that took place between workers and management? So let's go through some kind of general backstory of kind of what happened here at Homestead. Homestead is located in Pennsylvania. So here's where we're at. Here is the part in Pennsylvania, part of West Pennsylvania, where this steel mill is. The union, which is the group of workers who kind of unionize and kind of pull together to have solidarity, to help fight for things like working conditions and better pay, formed a union in this part of Pennsylvania called the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers. So as a union, they fight against these owners of these factories for things like better salary and better wages. And so they'll be kind of an important character in this story of the Homestead Strike, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers Union. The company is owned by actually Carnegie Steel, which, remember, Carnegie was this very wealthy captains of industry. He was this Scottish immigrant who came to America, kind of builds himself up from that rags to riches story. He learns of this Bessemer process that allows us to make steel faster and cheaper over in Europe, brings that back to the United States, and becomes the fourth largest producer of steel in the country. His company will later be sold to J.P. Morgan, but that hasn't happened yet. The Homestead Steel Mill was actually one of his competitors, and it goes out of business and because they can't compete with Carnegie, so Carnegie buys the company, and he ends up putting a guy called Henry Frick in charge of the Homestead Steel Mill. So when we think a little bit about Henry Frick, he's another very important character in this story. He's the on-scene business manager there at the mill. Carnegie lives back east. He's traveling around the world. He's very wealthy. He doesn't want to deal with the day-to-day operation, so he has managers who do all those things, and that's what Henry Frick is there. He's there to manage the factory. Another important player in this story is a group called the Pinkerton's Detective Agency. The Pinkerton Detective Agency is a private security agency that the Homestead Mill, ran by Henry Frick, is going to hire to break the strikers at Homestead. So those are kind of the players and the characters in this particular story and saga of the Homestead Strike. So let's look at the timeline here of kind of the events leading up to this very pivotal moment between labor and management, unions and union workers and these factory owners. So in 1876, the Amalgamated Association and Union for Iron and Steel Workers forms in 1876. In 1881, Andrew Carnegie places Frick in charge of the Homestead factory. In 1881 and 1882, the association wins two major strikes against the Carnegie Company, getting some major concessions, so things like working hours and safety working conditions and things like salary. The Carnegie Company, after 1889, the union's pretty powerful. It's a pretty large organization there at Homestead. Has had probably one of the strongest union contracts in the country. In February of 1892, the Amalgamated Association asks for a wage increase. That's part of that collective bargaining practice, right? So there's union representatives that meet with Frick. They sit down, they discuss, and they say, here are some of our demands, one of which is to increase some of our workers' wages. Frick responds with a wage decrease. He's going to actually lower the workers' salaries, which, as you can about imagine, did not go over very well with the workers. And so on June 29th, 1892, the contract basically expires. The old previous contract the workers were working under is no longer in effect, and the two sides can't really get to an agreement. They've been meeting, they've been discussing, but they're just kind of at an impasse. There's no compromises happening. So Frick decides to lock the workers out, and he actually builds, and you can see this in the photograph there, a huge, massive fence around the factory and puts barbed wire on top of it so that the workers basically cannot get in. On June 30th, 1892, the workers decided to basically go on strike, and they surround the plant to make sure that strike workers wouldn't enter. A common practice during this period of the industrial era is that when workers would go on strike, then you would have non-union workers brought in by the factory to keep the production going, which kind of hurts the whole idea behind the strike, which is to hurt the factory owners because they can't produce anything and sell their products and make a profit if there's no workers. But if there's workers, they can still keep production going. So the workers, the union workers, kind of surround there to keep the scabs, keep the non-union workers, the scabs is what they call them, going to the factory. On July 6, 1892, Frick and the sheriff can't get control of the strikers. I mean, they basically shut the factory down, and Frick decides he's got to hire more guns, hire kind of a security agency to help bring in these non-union workers. So he goes to, at the time, the largest private detective agency of the country, which is the National Pinkerton Agency, to basically help break the strike. And so he hires, basically this is like a private army in a sense. It's a private entity. It's not associated with the government. It's not a National Guard unit. It's not the military. These are private contractors who are basically brought in. They're armed, and they have the authority to break the strike, according to Frick. On July 6, 1892, the Pinkertons arrived to the steel mill by boat in the middle of the night, hoping to go unnoticed by the factory workers, but they are tipped off, and the strikers know they're coming, and pretty soon shots are fired on both sides, and there are people killed. Now, a historian looking at this event might ask a couple of some central questions, which are, who is to blame for this particular incident? How did the fighting start? And how did this incident, this Homestead labor strike, impact labor and management relations in other parts of the country as well? So one of the activities that we'll be doing in class is looking at some primary sources and analyzing them to see if we can, as a historian, come to a conclusion on these three questions. Who should be blamed for this incident? Is it the fault of Henry Frick? Is it the fault of the union workers? Or is it the fault of the Pinkertons, the detective agency that came in? So which of those three characters are responsible for it? You know, what started the fighting in the first place? Who fired the first shot? Was it the workers? Was it the Pinkertons? And then again, what kind of impact does this have on labor relations between management and the union workers in the later part of the 1800s? So that will be what we'll be discussing in class. So thank you for listening, and if you have questions, please make sure you come talk to your teacher. Thank you.